current assessment now, what will you get if the new rules come in?
Nothing. If I have any left over, I'm saving that up to buy a wheelchair. Really, there are days now when I should be using an electric wheelchair to get around independently. I don't have one of those, they're expensive.
The government thinks it can raise this amount of money, nearly £5 billion plus, through these cuts. In fact, most of those cuts, those savings will be wiped out because people who lose their benefits will then end up putting more pressure on the NHS. A bit of a dead end, this really, rather than a fundraiser. It's a dead end in terms of making poorer people even poorer.
I think we're always prepared to talk these things through, but we believe that reform of the welfare system is an essential thing to do, is the right thing to do.
The government say they're listening to disabled people, but we haven't seen the evidence of that with the lack of consultation on these huge cuts to disability benefits. If the government are really listening to disabled people, they will stop these cuts and they will meaningfully protect disability benefits.
I want this to be a Labour government that has Labour values at its core.
These cuts to benefits, do you feel that they represent Labour values?
I feel that reform is needed, and I think it's how that reform is done.
That's a very diplomatic answer, but what it wasn't
I'm
was,
diplomatic.
yes, I believe that Keir Starmer, what he's doing here, represents Labour values. So these cuts, do you think they represent Labour values?
I can tell you what I fought for all my years as a Labour MP and my Labour values. I can't tell you what other people's belief systems are.
I have said that we're going to do things differently. We're going to tell the truth, even when they are hard truths.
Wrong to balance the books on the backs of the sick and disabled people.
There are alternative, more compassionate ways to balance the books.
There are decisions made in this House that stay with you for the rest of your life. This is one of them.
Let me start with Katie's story, because behind every political decision, there's a human face. Katie was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2019. On the medical scale that measures MS severity from 1 to 10, she's at level 6. That's severe, life-changing, debilitating. Katie works from home, fighting her condition every single day. Her personal independence payment, what we call PIP, isn't luxury money. It's survival money. But under Starmer's new rules, Katie faces a terrifying reality. She could lose everything. What will you get if the new rules come in? She was asked. Nothing, she replied. Think about that for a moment. Nothing. Zero. A woman battling a progressive neurological disease, rated at level 6 severity, could have her lifeline cut completely. But here's where it gets even more heartbreaking. Katie told reporters she's saving every penny left over from her current benefits to buy a wheelchair. An electric wheelchair that would give her independence, dignity, the ability to leave her home. There are days now when I should be using an electric wheelchair to get around independently. I don't have one of those. They're expensive. This is the human reality behind the government's spreadsheet calculations. While ministers talk about £5 billion in savings, people like Katie are calculating whether they can afford basic mobility equipment that most of us take for granted. Now let's talk numbers, because the scale of these cuts is staggering. The Labour government wants to slash £5 billion annually from the welfare budget. That's not a typo. £5 billion every single year, taken from some of the most vulnerable people in our society. But here's the kicker, and this is where the government's plan falls apart completely. Most of these so-called savings will be wiped out because people who lose their benefits will end up putting more pressure on the NHS. It's not a money-saving exercise at all. It's shuffling vulnerable people from one underfunded system to another. Think about the cruel mathematics here. You cut someone's disability benefits, they can't afford proper care, their condition worsens, they end up in A&E, costing the NHS thousands. Where's the saving in that? This isn't fiscal responsibility. This is fiscal madness. The government's own impact assessments, the documents they don't want you to see, show that these cuts will primarily affect people with less severe conditions. But less severe doesn't mean not disabled. It doesn't mean doesn't need support. It means the government has decided to draw an arbitrary line and push people below it into poverty. But here's where this story takes a dramatic turn. Over 120 Labour MPs, that's more than a quarter of all Labour MPs, have signed an amendment to block their own government's bill. Let me put this in perspective. This isn't just a handful of usual suspects causing trouble. This is a massive revolt that cuts across all wings of the Labour Party. Backbench MPs, select committee chairs, former ministers, they're all saying the same thing: this is not what we signed up for. One first-time MP put it perfectly: "It wasn't in our manifesto, so it wasn't a pledge that I stood on when I got elected in July." This is a government implementing policies it never asked the public to vote for. The amendment they've tabled is what's called a reasoned amendment. Parliamentary language for this bill is so fundamentally flawed it shouldn't proceed. If this amendment passes, it doesn't just delay the bill. It kills it stone dead. We're talking about a government potentially losing its flagship legislation barely 6 months after taking power. Now we need to talk about something that will chill you to the bone. This isn't the first time we've seen welfare cuts target disabled people. And we know exactly what happens when you take away support from vulnerable people. Debbie Abrahams, the chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee, revealed shocking statistics that the government doesn't want you to know. When similar cuts were made to employment support allowance back in 2010, peer-reviewed research published in medical journals found that 600 additional suicides occurred as a direct result. 600 people took their own lives because their support was cut. But it gets worse. In 2017, welfare cuts led to 130,000 additional mental health cases and massive increases in severe poverty. And here's the terrifying part. The group of people who will be affected by these new cuts is 3 times larger than those previous cuts. Do the math. If 600 people died when a smaller group was affected, what happens when you target a group 3 times larger? When Debbie Abrahams was asked directly whether these cuts could cost lives, her answer was unequivocal: there is that risk. I did ask this in Work and Pensions questions on Monday, and there wasn't really an answer. The government has no answer because they know the truth. The government's defense of these cuts rests on a fundamental lie. They claim that cutting benefits will force disabled people into work. But here's the inconvenient truth they're trying to hide. There aren't enough jobs for disabled people. The UK has a 30% disability employment gap. That means 30% fewer disabled people are in work compared to non-disabled people. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report showing that suitable jobs for disabled people simply don't exist in sufficient numbers. So the government's logic goes like this: we'll cut your benefits next April, and you'll magically find jobs that don't exist, doing work that doesn't accommodate your condition, for employers who aren't required to hire you. It's not a policy, it's a fantasy. And while disabled people are supposed to be finding these non-existent jobs, they still need to eat. They still need heating. They still need medication. They still need the basic necessities of life that their benefits currently provide. The government is essentially saying, we'll take away your support and trust that somehow, somewhere, someone will employ you, despite the fact that we've done nothing to create those employment opportunities. This rebellion isn't just about welfare policy. It's about the fundamental nature of Keir Starmer's leadership and what kind of Labour Party he's trying to create. Remember, this is a man who campaigned on being different from the Conservatives, who promised a more compassionate approach to welfare, who said Labour would be the party of working people and those who need support most. But when push comes to shove, he's implementing cuts that would make even the Tories blush. The rebels aren't being subtle about their concerns. One MP said directly, "I want this to be a Labour government that has Labour values at its core." These cuts to benefits, do you feel that they represent Labour values? When government ministers are asked this question, they dodge and weave. They talk about reform being needed and give diplomatic answers. But they won't say the words, "Yes, these cuts represent Labour values." Because they know they don't. This is creating a crisis of identity for the Labour Party. Are they the party of social justice, or are they the party of austerity with a red rosette? The answer to that question will determine not just this bill's fate, but the fate of Starmer's entire project. Here's something that should terrify every viewer. The Work and Pensions Select Committee published a report just 1 month ago calling for a systems-based approach to safeguarding vulnerable claimants. They said that all policies affecting disabled people needed to consider safeguarding arrangements. As far as anyone knows, this hasn't happened with this bill. Let me spell out what that means. The government is implementing cuts that could affect millions of disabled people without proper safeguarding assessments. They're changing the rules without understanding who will be harmed. They're playing Russian roulette with people's lives. This isn't incompetence. This is willful negligence. The framework for protecting vulnerable people exists. The recommendations have been made. The government is choosing to ignore them. When disabled people die as a result of these cuts, and the evidence suggests they will, the government won't be able to claim ignorance. They've been warned. They've been given the tools to prevent harm. They're choosing to proceed anyway. So where does this leave us? The amendment signed by 120+ Labour MPs probably won't be selected by the Speaker. It's mainly symbolic. But symbols matter in politics, and this symbol is flashing red danger for Starmer's government. The Conservatives are circling like vultures, offering to help the Prime Minister if he jumps through some hoops. But even some of his own MPs are saying it's too late, that this flagship bill simply needs to be withdrawn. We're witnessing a government in crisis barely 6 months after taking power. The fundamental problem is that this policy was never properly thought through. It wasn't in the manifesto. It wasn't consulted on. It doesn't have public support. And it doesn't even save money when you factor in the knock-on costs to the NHS and other services. This is what happens when ideology trumps evidence. The government could delay implementation until they've done proper consultation, until Charlie Mayfield's review of the labour market is published, until they've created the jobs they claim exist. But that would require admitting they got it wrong, and political pride is preventing them from doing the right thing. This isn't just about welfare policy. This is about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country that supports its most vulnerable citizens? Or do we want to be a country that balances the books on the backs of disabled people? The choice is that stark. Katie, the woman with MS we met at the beginning, is still saving her pennies for a wheelchair. She's still working from home, still fighting her condition, still wondering if next month she'll have any support at all. Across the country, there are thousands of Katies. People with invisible disabilities, chronic conditions, mental health problems. People who work when they can, rest when they must, and rely on a social safety net that's about to be pulled away from under them. The rebels in Parliament are fighting for these people. They're risking their careers, defying their party leadership, and standing up for what they believe is right. But they can't do it alone. This is where you come in. This is your democracy, your welfare system, your society. If you believe that disabled people deserve support, dignity, and respect, then you need to make your voice heard. Contact your MP, join the conversation. Share this video. Because right now, while we're talking about politics in Westminster, real people are making impossible choices between heating and eating, between medication and mobility, between dignity and destitution. The government says they're listening, but we haven't seen the evidence. What we've seen is a government hell-bent on cuts, regardless of the human cost. What we've seen is a Prime Minister more concerned with his economic reputation than with the lives of disabled people. But we've also seen something else. We've seen resistance. Over 120 MPs willing to stand up and say no. Disabled people's organizations fighting back. Select committees publishing damning reports. Journalists asking the questions that ministers don't want to answer. This battle isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. The next few weeks will determine whether this government survives, whether these cuts go ahead, and whether Britain remains a country that cares for its most vulnerable citizens. What do you think? Will Starmer's government survive this rebellion? Are these cuts justified, or are they an attack on the most vulnerable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of this developing story, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Because this is the kind of breaking news that changes everything, and you don't want to miss what happens next.